Dame. Fern Naomi Renville and Maki Apide. My name is Fern Naomi Renville. Dakota. Sisituan Wapetuan. I am Sister Watson. I'm from the Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota, and I'm an enrolled member of the Sister Watson Oyate. Actually, can I ask you guys to come closer? Thank you, I appreciate that. I appreciate that you're here. I want to thank your teachers for inviting me to be here. My stories that I'm going to share with you today have a lot of history in them. And it's a history that we're starting to tell, but that hasn't been told yet. So to be a part of getting to tell the stories of Dakota experience here. Now, like I said, my name is Renville. That's my last name. My great-great-grandfather was Gabriel Renville, the last chief of the System Wapiton, one of the people who was a signatory to our treaty. It was like a big cheese. But he was only important because he had married 3 Wakaŋ sisters from a little village called Dakota, which is over in what's now known as St. Paul, what's now known as the Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary and Mounds Park. Both of those names are not quite accurate, but that place overlooks a lake now called Pig's Eye Lake. And right there, that village Dakota, that's where my great-great-grandmothers were from. These 3 sisters who represented a huge amount of social clout, spiritual clout, cultural clout, because in Dakota culture, Dakota women are the keepers of the lodge. We own our bark lodges and teepees and everything inside. And when a Dakota man from that time would marry, he would lodge that belonged to his wife. And those 3 sisters who were married to my great-great-grandfather, the important man, those 3 sisters represented the ties to that place, Kaposia, to the river that came, the 2 rivers that come together there in an estuary, carrying all this rich silt and depositing it on that, what used to be a floodplain there now. Now it's rail yards, but it used to be a floodplain, so it was a dynamic environment. And that rich soil was the best soil for Dakota mound gardens. And my great-great-grandmothers belonged to sacred plant societies. There were women who grew the pumpkins for our people. You had to be a very upstanding person to join that society. There were people who grew corn, who grew beans, had specialized knowledge. Those people were all women. Those women did this work that when settlers first came to this place, settlers saw the women doing all of the menial labor. And that's the only description you'll ever read in any public narrative about Dakota women in the early days of settlerhood. Oh, the women are doing the menial work. The women were doing the work that only respectable people could do. So women, with our ability to bring forth life with our bodies, we were associated with the power to bring forth food from the body of Mother Earth. And so we were considered to be adapted in particular for that role and responsibility of growing food. Well, so we're talking about Minnesota's first farmers. I was out to lunch with Valentine and Kate and Addie right before, and I was describing how if you were to read all of the newspapers published in the Twin Cities, the Pioneer Press, and there were a couple others from the 1830s until 1900. You would never read any description of Dakota agriculture beyond maybe a comment or two about how the women have to do the menial work of hoeing the corn. The only Dakota people who were described were the men in these, especially in the newspapers. There's fascinating stuff if you ever want to go digging around. The Dakota people were always described as savage, nomadic, barbarian, hunter-gatherers, who were always making war. They didn't till the earth, blah, blah, blah. And it's true, the men did not, but our women absolutely did. The men had other goals and responsibilities. Now, the other thing is that the military and missionaries are both incredible bookkeepers. They're huge bureaucrats. And so you can go back and find the literal receipts of early missionaries and militaries who bought food, traded food with Dakota women. So just like on the East Coast, when settlers arrived, they were relying on Indigenous women for literal survival. And at that time, absolutely, settlers bought and traded for meat and game with Dakota and Ojibwe men. But the women were the ones who provided all this produce. And that was what early missionary settlers and military particularly wanted, because those dudes could go catch their own game for the most part. But I'm also like I have some seed varieties of Dakota beans that I'm about to plant. I'm like, you can't tell me that Dakota women didn't also share seeds with settlers too. I bet that happened. So this story is completely invisible, though. It's been erased, mostly because when settlers first came here, their experience of gender equity was non-existent. The first time people saw and witnessed balanced gender relations was when the settlers arrived on the East Coast and met Haudenosaunee people and experienced and saw female governance that was alive and well. And I was a little aside, but a lot of people don't know that Benjamin Franklin was formally adopted by an Onondaga family. And they attended that Continental Congress and all of the meetings that was about how to govern this new, how this new America would govern itself. So those indigenous ideas and contributions have been formative to what we now call the United States, and yet it's completely invisible. Now, the stories and knowledge that I have are largely not written in books, because this is oral knowledge too. So this idea of I'm gonna stop talking in just a minute and tell a story, but I just wanted to go back to this idea of these women who were married to my great-great-grandfather, these three sisters. So when settlers arrived and saw polygamous marriages, they interpreted that as, oh, these Dakota women are oppressed and subjugated by their husbands who are like their masters or something. And I was like, that is so ridiculous, because the way Dakota women, the way my Dakota female elders talked about polygamous marriage, for one thing, if you had more than one wife, that would be typically a pair or trio of sisters. So I'm like, imagine you're a husband in a household, that you'll have more feminine power keeping you in check if you're with one woman or with three sisters who are all looking out for each other. So that was seen as preferable in a Dakota family because it was seen as women having numbers to reinforce feminine power in the home. So, and Dakota women would say, men are so much work, but it's a good thing that I have these sisters to share the work. So it wasn't men who had a bunch of women, it was women sharing the work of taking care of a household. And so one of the things that happened when the Dakota uprising happened and the Dakota people were first placed in Fort Snelling and then relocated to the reservation that I grew up on, was that the military and missionaries stepped in and dissolved all the polygamous marriages. So my family has a story to tell about how my great-great-grandfather had to give up 2 of those out of the 3 he had married. And he chose the oldest sister to stay with him because he thought she would have the poorest chance of remarrying. And thus were the first illegitimate children, unwed mothers, homeless mothers. Those things didn't exist before this time. And we were told by the missionaries that this was for our own good. It was to teach us how to be loving, civilized people. So you are probably hearing the dehumanization in here. I'm working as the Dakota cultural educator for Wakaŋ Tipi Awaŋyaŋkapi, which is the ones who watch over Wakaŋ Tipi, which is what the traditional name of that place is, that is now called Mounds Park and Spento Nature Sanctuary. That name is there's a process underway to change that formally. And ground has broken on the first ever Dakota Cultural Center, which is at the foot of those bluffs underneath Mounds Park. And just to clarify, we're not talking about a park, we're talking about a cemetery. So at the top of Mounds Bluff are those burial mounds. There are, there's like, I'd say like seven or eight of them that are still really very visible and accentuated and intact. But at one time there were 80 burial mounds covering that whole bluff and bluff side. Those burial mounds were not removed. They were simply flattened. So all of the ancestors buried in those 80 mounds, we're talking thousands of people, are still there. They're still there. But right now, this piece of land that I'm talking about is classified as a park, but it's not a park, it's a cemetery. So this is part of the work of Wakaŋ Tipi. Our goal very explicitly is to have this place recognized by the state and the feds as a burial ground, as an active cemetery. So right under those bluffs and burial mounds, in the face of that white cliff, in the white bluffs, there's a cave. Now, this cave, which is called Wakaŋ Tipi, and which is where Wakaŋ Tipi gets its name from, is a sacred cave. And back in the day, women would go into that cave, which used to be covered with petroglyphs of, among other figures, maybe the serpent spirit who protects laboring and birthing. So our women would go into this cave where there's a spring that never freezes, that runs year round. And they would give birth and wash babies in that first spring. And the water flows out of that cave and down the hillside and into the river. And so there's this connection going on between the cave, world below, the mounds, the world above, which then reflects the global sphere above us. So this idea that all of Dakota existence is encapsulated in this place. So you see, I have a tattoo, which my partner Roger did. This is actually from, this was designed from the cave. This is known as an inverted double lodge. And this symbol represents Dakota philosophy and worldview. As things are up above or in heaven, so they are on earth. That's actually a very familiar saying, isn't it? It's not strictly Dakota. Many philosophies and spiritual traditions talk about balance between the material and the spiritual world. So for Dakota people, the Wakaŋ Tipi site represents where all these things exist in the same place. And in doing so, they embody this, we call it like a multi-dimensional aspect of Dakota worldview. So that's a lot of talking. This site, oh, let me tell this story, because this is a powerful story. So this site, Wakaŋ Tipi, when my people were exiled, the Schmidt brewery family and another brewery family, I can't remember which ones, they took over the cave and the springs. They blew up the cave. They destroyed all the petroglyphs and widened the mouth of the cave. And they used the spring water to make beer and to refrigerate beer. And for over 100 years, that is the purpose that this place served. And then the breweries abandoned this site, and it was a homeless encampment. It was an informal dump. It literally was a dump site. The rail yards have used it for all sorts of industrial things that have polluted it. And it was a very much an abused place. It's most in the Twin Cities. And then in 1997, a group of white homeowners living along that bluff came together and formed a nonprofit that its mission would be to protect and repair this green belt. And so there's a fellow named Dan McGinnis, who's the former board chair of what then became known as Lower Phalen Creek Project. This group of non-native folks realized that they needed some Dakota input. And so they consulted with Dakota people. And when they learned that this was in fact not just this neglected green belt next to their homes, but the most sacred site of the people, they decided they needed Dakota partnership. And so this group of white people sought out Dakota partnership. And as this group of people became more and more educated and invested in the Dakota history of this place, they decided what they really needed was Dakota leadership. And 4 years ago, the white leadership of Lower Phalen Creek Project stepped aside. There's been a Dakota woman named Maggie Lorenz the last 4 years. She's just been totally kicking butt in this role. And we have, it's funny, we have one token guy. We have one man. It's an all-female organization, and our key roles are filled by Native people. So that is not a story that I hear or see very often of real allyship, where people actually give up power and step aside and place themselves in subordinate but supportive roles. So that is what is happening there. And right now, our organization is making some progress on forming formal, binding, legal agreements with the city of St. Paul, and then eventually with the state of Minnesota to co-manage this place. Now, Dakota people have never believed that land is better off without people, that we're inherently polluting negative forces. In fact, when settlers came to this land, something that a lot of people don't understand, and it's really a dark truth, and that is that 90% of my Dakota ancestors died in the first 3 decades of the 18th century, thanks to smallpox and flu. So settlers were arriving in a very depopulated landscape and could not imagine the number of people that this whole Mississippi River supported. Even further down, there were cities that had thousands of people living in them. And guess what? They left almost no trace. You would never know by walking through the land, because Native people were such effective and experienced co-managers. I actually hate that term, but it's the word used by natural resource agencies. But what we weren't co-managing resources. We were in relationships. We were in relationships with our relatives. I can tell you a story about the Dakota worldview. So you probably heard Dakota, Awasin, we're all related. In the beginning, before anything existed, back before this world had been created, there were only 2 great cosmic forces in the world. One was a male spirit named Eon, who possessed all the creative power of the universe. The other cosmic force was a female spirit named Hahepi, and Hahepi possessed all the creative potential of the universe. And so these 2 cosmic forces lived alone in the great nothing. At that time, they were the only 2 beings, and it was a little lonely. And maybe they weren't that different than you and I, because they wanted a family, they wanted a community. And so Enoch knew that he alone possessed all the creative power to spark life, and knew that if any new beings were to come into existence, he would have to relinquish some of his creative power. And so Enoch reached inside himself and took out, they say that he removed most of that power. He took that power and shaped it into a ball, like a ball of red clay, they say, and took that ball of red clay and placed it into the great nothing, into Hahepi, who possessed the power of creative potential. She could become anything. And so was Mother Earth born, Pushnipa, or grandmother. So there was Mother Earth. She had just created, but she was still all alone. And so Ea reached inside himself and removed more of his power and made the stars, the planets, the heavens, made all the spirits and the stars and this world for grandmother Earth to live in, so that she would have light and day and night and time and so on. And then Ea had given away all of his creative power. He had not retained any for himself, gave it all away to make us. And then Ea had only one thing left to give: blood. Now they say that Ea's blood was blue, and that he opened his veins and let that blue blood flow down onto the newborn Mother Earth. Now half of this blood, this blue blood, covered Mother Earth, the whole surface, and became the first floodwaters. And the other half of this blue blood flowed up into the atmosphere and became the sky that protects us and that we breathe today. And now Nia had given away everything, possessed nothing now, and was now, as we know, Nia the rock was now hard, gray, shriveled. Nia fell to the surface of that newborn earth and fell under those floodwaters and became the first rock. And thus, Grandfather Rock and Grandmother Earth are the grandparents, the ancestors of all of us. All things on earth come from them. Now, we get our spirit and our power not just, it's not just us who receive that, but all things on earth. We're relatives, Ethiopian, my relatives. But we're also related to Grandfather Rock. We're related to the trees. We are related to everything in this creation. And the latest cutting edge science around astrophysics and quantum and string theory will tell you exactly the same thing. So Western scientific knowledge is starting to catch up a little bit with Dakota indigenous philosophies and knowledge. Know that we're connected. We know that what we do to the web of life, we do to ourselves. Know that we are connected and that we have roles and responsibilities to one another as family. Not just us, but we literally have roles and responsibilities to all of the creation in this world. And this is where we have a chance right now, all of us, to re-engage in our relationships with this creation. We have a chance to re-engage, and we have a chance to change the stories that we tell and the stories that we believe. My partner Roger is also a storyteller, and he and I talk a lot about storytelling and how destabilized culture and societies are when we don't have a story to believe in. Right now, when I look at the United States, I see a lot of very competing mythologies and stories that are radically different, and I'm not sure how they will ever be that Dakota people tell. They share our worldview and they share our philosophy, but they also share our science. Now, that really simple short story that I just told you, one thing I like to point out is that the various anthropologists who lived and studied Dakota people say that we've been telling that story for at least 2,000 years and probably longer. Now, 2,000 years ago, Europe wasn't anywhere near the kind of astronomical knowledge that you would need to tell a story about the Earth being a ball. This was hundreds of years before Galileo was being locked up for insisting that maybe the Earth wasn't flat. So living here on the prairie, Dakota people had and are recovering an extremely sophisticated understanding of the stars, which are just an incredibly reliable teacher. And our mythic stories, which were typically associated with wintertime telling because of where we live. When it's winter, we go inside, we go into our winter lodge and tell stories. But our stories are embedded with knowledge that white people, when they first heard them, they didn't hear the science in those stories. They didn't understand that stories are a pedagogy, that this is how oral culture is passed on. And one thing that Roger also, I haven't quoted you today, but there's an author named Tong Lee who said something like orality is without literacy, but literacy does not exist without orality. So storytelling as a primary mode of learning, of human knowledge transmission, has been devalued by Western education. Now, I know a lot of Dakota stories, and they come to me through all these Dakota people I know. And the reason we all know our stories is that when we were taken away from the Twin Cities and placed on the reservation, remember I told you the missionaries were there, micromanaging, overseeing every aspect of our lives and telling us what we could or could do. There was a very short list of acceptable activities for Dakota people to be engaging in. We literally couldn't. There were so many things we weren't allowed to do. We were like children in the eyes of the government. But we were allowed to tell our traditional stories. The missionaries were like, well, they're really not, they're kind of offensive, but they're just harmless stories, right? Fairy tales. And the truth is, those missionaries and settlers probably didn't respect their own stories as much, any more than the Dakota stories. So stories as being, traditional stories as being irrelevant or old-fashioned or just for children or like archaic and defunct, couldn't be. So I just told you that story, and if I had not teased out that detail about, we're talking about people who understood that Earth is a sphere at a time when Europe did not. You would have still learned and heard that, but it would have been a little bit unconscious. It might have popped into your head later. But storytelling is embedded with knowledge that is not presented like linear information. So we're not even aware that we're learning just hearing a story. So, how is it? 1:40. Oh, okay. I think I should wrap things up and let you guys ask questions, but I just wanted to say that we all have traditional stories that inform where we come from and who we are. And I regularly talk with non-native students who are like, well, I don't know my traditional stories or my culture. I was like, are you familiar with Walt Disney catalog? That's your culture. Those are all traditional stories. We all come from a people, a place, and a story tradition. Everyone does, not just Dakota people. And that source of knowledge has been absolutely devalued and trivialized in Western education, and it's a secret gem and hidden superpower for teaching. Everyone would rather listen to a story than a lecture. But I also want to stop and give you guys a chance to ask questions. And I also meant to tell you more stories rather than talking in a flabby mood. But so does anyone have any questions while I'm here?
You say when you talk about the mud, it's active as cemeteries, they won't still be buried there?
So, not official, not in the official narrative. That's all I'll say.
Will it ever become an active cemetery again?
That is the goal. Yeah, that's the goal. And literally, if you're looking for any accumulation of literal bodies of our ancestors, they're like right there. And for my band, my Dakota band, it's like this literally where we placed our dead, and the idea that our ancestors could see us where we went, and we could see them. So I believe this will happen in my lifetime. I see it happening in other places, and I see this consciousness arising around this sort of awareness, like, oh, I guess it's kind of dehumanizing to tell people that their cemetery is a park. And so it's just a process of education and reversing the literal villainization of Dakota people, the stories. Another weird thing I will say about the mounds that is probably the single thing that I just like gnaws at me, and that is that for 50 years, white archaeologists and paleontologists insisted that a group of people called the Hopewell culture built the mounds, and that Dakota people had invaded their territory in our bloodthirsty ways. We killed them all off. That's why they're not around. And I can remember being a kid and reading this in a textbook and feeling insanely gaslit. Like, what? So there are textbooks in public schools today that still contain this absolutely fallacious, fantastic knowledge that supposedly, it's in a textbook, so it's got to be real, right? So this uncovering, these are Dakota ancestors right here, and there's no such thing as the Hopewell culture. But yeah. Yes. So that is actually something that we've been working on for a few years. So that literally now I think a lot of the folks who live up around what's now known as Mounds Park, once those folks learned that literally some of their houses are built on top of, changed how they felt, because a lot of people just didn't know. They imagined, oh, there used to be burial mounds here, but they removed them. So they must have taken the bodies somewhere, right? No, they're still all under the ground right there. So education and awareness and helping people to imagine how they would feel if this was their family. So I see it happening. Something that you all can do today that would be really important. If you go onto Wakaŋ Tipi's website, there is a link where you can send a request to our state legislatures to approve this spending bill that is investments in facilities for organizations of color and Native entities in the state of Minnesota. Maybe you've been hearing about this. But literally, that's an investment in capacity of Native entities to do this work of protecting not just sacred spaces, but places for everyone. So I have been living on the West Coast for a number of years, especially out there, but I see it happening here too. Biggest environmental movements and gains are led by lawyers working for Native tribes in the courts. Native tribes are fighting for all of us around resource protection in a way that no one else is. So when we invest in Native organizations, we are investing in frontline, literally the most effective protectors of land and water. So that today.
One thing that I have been personally interested in is just a general restoration of endonyms for like place names, landmarks, and stuff like that for Native peoples. Do you have any advice for like researching and consulting with people for just like what local features could be renamed?
That's beautiful. And it's funny because it's been pointed out that a lot of people are like, well, I can't speak Dakota, but if you say Minnesota, you're already speaking it. So there is more and more available through the state of Minnesota and through various municipalities. But I think some of your best information is always going to go when you go to tribal resources. So for instance, most tribes have their own curriculum and programming that is for their own education. And so those are great places. So tribes are great resources. And I'm always like, go. And of course, like, how do you connect with the tribe? Go to an event that tribe is hosting. Go to their museum. Go to a powwow. There's lots of ways. I think that supporting tribal sovereignty is a powerful way to be investing in frontline defenders of the earth.
From the far side. Yeah.
Wakaŋ Tipi? Yeah.
I'll share the link for the signing on to the.
So I'm one of a newer batch of employees at Wakaŋ Tipi. We're just ramping up our capacity and we're starting to offer more programming, but you can sign up on our website and we host regular reparation opportunities, but we also are hosting more and more education and opportunities to come and learn and come and help. Are very welcome.
I just have a question for the group. I'd love to hear reflections from folks about how what you've heard today kind of meshes with what we've been talking about in class and how you're thinking about how does all of this information sort of align with the challenge or reinforce your thinking around reparations and relations and restoration, the things that we've been talking about all semester. I just love to hear from folks about how you're sort of why you think we think it's important for Fern and the partner to be here and share this with you. From other classes visiting are also welcome in the space.
Yes, absolutely. And there's no right or wrong reflections or feelings. Share with you.
It's like a perfect example of the danger of a single story. Yeah, I don't know, like just different stories that you were telling today, what like the westernized culture is telling in textbooks and whatnot. Active violence towards people.
Pointing that out. Erasure is violence.
Thinking of reparations as a whole in this class, like different speakers and learning about different forms of reparations. As for different things, like for more than once, that land or the restoration of land and various sites is especially important to Indigenous people. And it's neat having you here because you know about a location that I think is familiar to a lot of us. So it's like understand something that we can visualize.
Absolutely. Abstract learning doesn't usually stick.
Is to see effective local activity, like local political activity, you know, making changes, because a lot of these things have to happen from the ground up rather than from the top down. So having like a framework and demonstration of this is very nice to see.
Absolutely. And I should say that I've been on the advisory committee at Wakaŋ Tipi for years, but I just moved here last year from the West Coast for a while. So I'm arriving at just the time when all these things are coming together, that amazing people behind me. So all the hardest work, I think, has already been done by people who came before me. So here I am. So in a way, I kind of get to be here for the fun part, telling this beautiful story and seeing the progress when we go forward.
I'd love to reflect on it. We've been talking a bit about infrastructure and the way that infrastructure is a space of contest and whose infrastructure is allowed to decay and whose gets renewal and how do we influence that. And when you were describing the mounds, it made me really appreciate, we have a Center for Anthropological Services. And we haven't been reading much Donna Haraway, but there's this idea of staying with the trouble, staying with it over time. And I just really want to lift up the work of the colleagues. We have a lot of anthropological colleagues who've been in this really troubled field that really othered people and was part of this erasure. And yet a lot of the work here on campus is working in service of tribal work. And over many years of doing burial restoration when highways ran into burial mounds, there's now a process being adopted to not run into burial mounds and to work in relation. And I think it's so exciting that we are at a moment where there's a lot to repair, but it's becoming a part of the story that is the work before us.
Critical mass of work has been done. And now things are starting to happen and the momentum is building. So I think that's why we see so much social turmoil, is because people are destabilized by such fast changes. But some of these changes are for the better. Oh, as an old history nerd, the kind of public education that I was exposed to as a young person didn't have anything like this. So I'm so excited for you all. I'm so grateful for your interest in your vision. And thank you to your teachers for bringing me here and looking after your in this way.